For over 90 years, Westminster Theological Seminary has trained leaders for ministry like Tim Keller and Alistair Begg. Now, you can earn a degree in counseling, theology, or ministry from Westminster entirely online. Visit ministrynetwork.com/degree to learn more. Now, on to our episode. Hi, and welcome to the Ministry Network podcast. I'm your host, James Baird. Today, you'll hear from Rachael Denhollander, an accomplished lawyer, author, and speaker. She's given many talks at prestigious schools like Harvard, Stanford, and NYU. In 2018, she was named one of Time magazine's most influential people. Rachael is known for leading the charge against Larry Nassar, one of the most prolific abusers in recent history. Rachael will share with us today about how ministry leaders should approach the issue of abuse. Don't forget to visit ministrynetwork.com to join our online community, where you can discuss this episode with other Christians and get access to exclusive book discounts. All right, Rachael. Well, like I said, we're really excited to talk to you. One thing, as I was going through your amazing book, What is a Girl Worth? One thing that became really clear to me was how a lot of the character strengths that it seems like you drew upon later in life were really instilled in you during your upbringing. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your story during your early years and some lessons that still stick with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I have the highest respect and gratitude for my parents because really the foundation for everything that God was able to make happen really did take place during my childhood. And there were a couple really key things. First, just from a standpoint of healing from trauma, I was incredibly blessed to have a very healthy version of masculinity, a very healthy version of femininity, a beautiful marriage in front of me, a healthy representation of godly sexuality. And so in my experience, while I obviously experienced the twisting of those concepts, I had a healthy framework to fall back on. I had the contrast presented to me, and that is just critical when it comes to healing from trauma. In addition to that, my parents were incredibly intentional in how they taught us just to think and to love. And I think if I had to pick a few of the top lessons that really helped shape me growing up, the very first one really would be humility, the willingness to admit when you're wrong, the desire to learn from the people around you, and the conviction to do what is right, no matter what it costs. And my parents really challenged us growing up to check our motivations, to look at why we were doing what we were doing. Because one of the lessons my mom hammered home to me all the time, I was a very argumentative child. I was built to be an attorney. And so there would be times that I'd be arguing with my parents, and my mom would say to me, "Why are you arguing with me right now? Are you arguing with me because you just want to be right? You want to win? Or are you arguing with me because you convictionally believe this is the right thing and that people will be hurt if we don't do this?" And that was incredibly powerful for me because the truth is that the gifts and abilities God has given us really can be weaponized to do terrible things. And it is not uncommon, even for Christians, to adopt almost an end justifies the means approach to how we do ministry. If I can just get to this place, it doesn't matter what I need to do to get there. And we forget that our motivation is as key as anything else. And so for my parents to challenge me on that, to be motivated by love no matter what I do, was incredibly foundational. And then I think the other thing I would really peg is that my parents were very intentional in teaching us that success is to be faithful with what you're given. They even growing up, we were constantly instilled with there is no one highest calling. Yeah, and this is something we see in Christianity a lot, where there are certain callings or roles or positions that are elevated as being almost the most important or more worthy of attention or more holy or more righteous. Yeah, and my parents really very intentionally stood against that. And they said, no, being faithful and success is doing whatever God has placed in front of you. And they would use the parable of the talents, and that he who is faithful with little will be given much. And so, they would tell us, if that means you are a janitor the rest of your life, you be a janitor to the glory of God, and you glorify him in whatever you do, wherever you are, with whoever you're with. And so, the transition that I've experienced over the last couple of years from being a stay-at-home mom and a wife, and being faithful in the very simple things to having a platform I never anticipated really did come from those very foundational lessons. And the ability to withstand even the trauma of coming forward so publicly came from the realization that faithfulness is doing what God has given me to do, and that the results are not dependent on me. And that really frees us up to do what is right, no matter the cost, and to not be dependent on the results that we achieve, and to not be dependent on the societal response to our work.
Wow, that's really helpful and encouraging. And it sounds like a lot of the character strengths that you need to both support victims and respond well to trauma really start with those core ideas that you just shared. What would be some advice you would give parents who want to develop resilient children, able to respond well to victims and to abuse?
I think the most important thing we can do for our kids is help them find their identity in Christ, to know where their value comes from. Because when you know where your value comes from, you know that your identity comes from your Creator and your Redeemer. You know that nothing can diminish that, nothing can take it away, and you know that you're not dependent on the response you receive. Your value does not come from your achievements. It does not come from your mere accomplishments. That helps guard against both just crushing depression if you don't achieve what you think you should. My mom used to tell me, there's always going to be somebody smarter than you. There's always going to be somebody prettier than you. There's always going to be somebody who's more skilled than you. And if you're finding your value in those outside things, that is going to put you in a position where you are just devastated when all of a sudden you're not the best. And so that lesson, I think, is the most important thing that parents can instill in their children, because when they understand their identity and their value in Christ, that's the highest value you can possibly have. Nothing can diminish or change it. But it also protects you from arrogance and from moral compromise.
Switching a little bit, but still staying in your early life, I think some might be somewhat surprised to hear that you first experienced abuse in the context of the church. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of that story to help our listeners understand how abusers don't always look the way that we think that they will.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, abusers rarely look the way that we think they will. A lot of people want to think of the church as the safest place, and it ought to be the safest place. But there are actually a couple of very key things that we know about abusers. We know that statistically, abuse is every bit as prevalent in the church as it is out of it, which means 1 in 4 girls are going to be sexually assaulted by the time they reach adulthood, and 1 in 6 boys at minimum. And those numbers are just as high in the church as they are out of the church. We also know that predators intentionally target faith communities. And they target them intentionally because a lot of the ways that we wield our theology incorrectly, our theologies of grace and forgiveness, can often leave predators in positions of power and silence the victims. And so predators intentionally target faith communities. We also know, if we examine the data, that we actually have very high rates of sexual abuse in churches because of this dynamic. In fact, we typically think of the Catholic Church as the kind of the preeminent example of sexual assault scandal in a religious sphere. But in actuality, a review of claims by against insurance companies for sexual assault found that if you review the top 3 insurance companies for Protestant ministries, churches and Protestant ministries, they actually receive more claims of sexual assault by clergy or people in leadership than the Catholic Church receives against their insurance companies, despite the fact that the Catholics actually do a better job keeping track. If you look historically over the last 12 to 13 years, at the number one reason churches are found liable in federal court, the number one reason churches are found liable in federal court almost every single year is for mishandling sexual assault allegations. So we actually have very high rates of abuse in the church. The church is a place that predators target, and we have a long track record of handling it incorrectly. And I fit this statistic. I was sexually assaulted at age 7 in my local church, and I experienced both the positive and the negative responses that typically result in evangelical and conservative communities. There was a group of adults in my church who were trained sexual assault counselors. They recognized the warning signs of abuse. They came to my parents and they said, "I think we have a problem." And my parents immediately acted to protect me. And because of them, I was saved from worse abuse. But I also experienced the very stereotypical response that victims experience, particularly in faith communities, which was the accusation that my parents had made an accusation without foundation, that we couldn't prove abuse had happened. I hadn't verbalized it yet. And the fact that I was afraid of this person, the fact that trained experts said, look, there are some problems here. We're seeing warning signs. That wasn't enough for a significant number of people in my church. And the end result was that we ended up being isolated from the rest of the church and really treated very poorly. And by age 8, I was reeling from sexual assault that I didn't understand and hadn't verbalized, and also reeling from having lost all of the adults that up until that point in my life had defined my idea of church and faith community. We lost everything.
As a result, a lot of your work has been emphasizing the role that dysfunctional institutions can play in perpetuating abuse. I was wondering if you would help a lot of our members on Ministry Network understand how they, as church leaders, can actually be part of the solution instead of the problem.
Yeah, that is something I'm just incredibly passionate about, because as a Christian, I do believe that the gospel is our greatest refuge. It's our greatest comfort. That hope of redemption, that promise of God's holiness and justice and righteousness is our greatest comfort. And actually, most sexual assault victims believe that. There was a study that was done a couple of years ago that asked sexual assault victims who they thought was going to be the most helpful when they were assaulted. And the number one pick for assault victims of who they thought would be the most helpful was churches, pastors. And the reason for that is because of what we teach. When abuse victims look at the idea of the holiness of God and how we preach against sin and we cry for justice, and all of these theologies that we teach, the natural response is surely someone who understands holiness to this extent will understand the depth of the evil done to me. Surely someone who preaches the idea of God's justice will understand why justice is so important. Surely someone who understands the idea of human depravity will understand how even someone who looks good can really plumb the depths of evil. And because of what we teach, we appear to be the best at responding to sexual assault. Victims anticipate that religious leaders will be some of the best. But then they asked a follow-up question at the end of the survey, and they asked who actually was the most helpful when you disclosed your abuse. And when they asked that question, churches and religious leaders ranked dead last, behind the option of other. And that breaks my heart, because the reality is churches should be the safest place. Religious leaders and pastors should be the best refuge because of the theology that we hold. And that is my heart's cry, is for pastors and religious leaders to understand just the incredible power that they have to paint a picture of the gospel that is restorative and beautiful. Darkness and light exist in opposition to each other. And when you dim the darkness, the beauty of the light is not nearly so brilliant to you. If you walk out of a dimly lit room into another dimly lit room, it's not much of a transition. But if you walk out of a pitch black room into the noonday sun, the glory is just blinding. And we have to understand that when we do not acknowledge the depth of evil and treat evil like it really is evil, what we have in turn done is dimmed the glory and the beauty of God. We should be the best at responding to abuse because we should be the best at understanding the depth of the evil.
Wow. I've often heard people respond to victims by asking the question, why did you wait so long to report? Mm-hmm. Could you help our community understand why it often does take some time before something comes out or for someone to speak up or even to be heard?
I understand where that question comes from. And so I appreciate getting the chance to really talk about that because it's understandable why that question comes. As far as childhood abuse, I think it's important to understand that a delayed disclosure is actually normal. In fact, well into adulthood, most studies estimate between 40s and 50s is the average age of disclosure for childhood sexual abuse, and many victims never disclose at all. And so as much as we want to initially think that it's abnormal, it's actually the norm for the disclosure to be delayed. And that happens for a number of reasons. In the case of childhood abuse, it's not uncommon for the child to not realize they're being abused, particularly if the abuse has been ongoing. Children, no matter how well they're educated, lack sexual knowledge. And that's good. And so when they are being abused, it's not abnormal for the child to not even realize that abuse has taken place, particularly because it's taking place with someone that they trust, who they have an emotional connection to, who should be safe. And so that's part of the reason for a delayed disclosure is many times the victims don't know that they're being abused. And another factor is that oftentimes once they do realize, the shame is so, so great, and verbalizing it is so difficult that it keeps them silent for a very long time. Victims carry significant guilt for not stopping their abuse. And even though this guilt is unfounded because it is not their fault, they carry that guilt. And so speaking up puts them in a position where often that shame is just heaped on them societally because of those types of questions. If it's that big of a deal, why didn't you report? Why didn't you speak up? Did you fight back? What were you wearing? How could you not know? Those questions just heap the shame and guilt that the victims are already feeling. Another dynamic is that verbalizing really makes the abuse real. In order to verbalize the abuse to someone, you have to describe what you've experienced. And that requires facing those memories and facing that reality in a way that's deeply painful and traumatic. In addition to that, as the child matures, and I experience this very much myself, as the child matures and watches the community around them, victims are acutely aware of how survivors are typically treated and how seriously abuse is usually taken. We are constantly watching the discussions around us, and we see the way that people talk about abuse when it comes up, in the news cycle, in athletics, in politics. And you watch the way those survivors are treated, and you intrinsically know that's what they would say about me. That's how well my community understands the dynamics of abuse. That's how well they would be able to process the evidence I bring them. Those are the kinds of judgments they would make about me. And it's not a safe place to speak up because of how the community around you discusses the issue of abuse.
One of our members asks, how can we make our churches a safer and easier place for victims to make courageous disclosure? How would you respond to that?
I really appreciate that question. And I get that question a lot. What's the most important thing we can do? And usually when someone asks that question, they're thinking policy. What policies can we put in place? And policy is good. You need good policies. And you need to get those policies from a trustworthy organization. Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in a Christian Environment is my top recommendation when it comes to making policy and to getting trained on the issue of abuse. But the most important thing you really do is you message how much it matters to you, because that's what changes the culture of an institution. It's how you talk about the issues. So pastors, are you preaching on the concept of God's justice? Are you preaching on issues of abuse and compassion and understanding the depth of evil that is done when injustice is done? Are you advertising the policies that you have so that your congregation knows that those policies are going to be taken seriously and they know where to go if they need help? Do you have resources? Have you partnered with community resources so that if someone does make a disclosure, you know how to walk them through that process? And those are some of the things that we lay out in the Caring Well curriculum that I was a part of, that the SBC has put up publicly. But those are the most important things you can do, is really how you message on the issue of abuse, because that is what communicates culturally, but to a survivor, that they'll be safe to speak up, that you understand trauma, that you understand what evidence does and doesn't look like, that it's going to be taken seriously if you disclose. It's also what messages to an abuser that a victim's going to be listened to if they speak up. And so for both parties, both the abuser and the victim, how you message publicly is the most critical thing you can do in changing the culture of your ministry to be one that really reflects the holiness and the goodness of God.
That's so helpful, Rachel. Thank you. Another member asked, how can I, as a pastor, come alongside a young sexual abuse survivor and her family?
One of the things that pastors need to do is just be thinking through the practicalities of someone who has spoken up. If the family is walking through a disclosure to the police or to CPS, to think through the practicalities of what that family is facing. The reality that one phone call from a detective or a prosecutor can upend the entire day, that you often don't have much notice when it comes to giving interviews and going to court. And so on a very practical level, not just prayer and checking in with, hey, how can I pray for you? But looking at practically what that family might need. We put new mothers on meal trains, and we put people who are sick or in the hospital on meal trains. Can you bring a meal to a family who is suffering so deeply? Some of those practical things are the most important you can do when a family is walking through that process. But I do think another thing that pastors really desperately need to do is to understand the depth of trauma. And when you begin to understand what trauma does and how it changes how the mind and body actually physically work, it really helps guide your response to that survivor. For example, when you understand that one of the greatest things that's lost in sexual assault is the ability of the victim to use their voice and to be heard, to have their choices heard. That helps guide you in giving support to the survivor in a way that gives them a choice. You have very simple things like, would you like the door open or closed when we meet to pray? Are you more comfortable with someone in the room, or would you prefer that there not be multiple people in the room just because it's such a sensitive topic? Just that very simple idea of giving the survivor a choice is something that you understand better when you understand the depth of trauma. I think it also helps guide the pastor in understanding why expert help from a licensed psychologist or counselor is going to be invaluable. We typically think of trauma as something that's more on an emotional level, but trauma actually physically changes how our bodies operate. For example, there's a book that I highly recommend, and it doesn't come from a Christian perspective, but the medical and scientific information in it is fantastic. It's called The Body Keeps the Score, and it was written by a psychologist who really pioneered a lot of the research into PTSD. And just one very helpful thing that comes out of that book, as an example, is the reality that when they have done brain scans of survivors who are enveloped in a flashback, their brain actually resembles the scan of a stroke victim. There are actually whole regions of the brain that shut down in a flashback. But what lights up in a flashback is the region of our brain that processes current information. And so one of the things that we now know about trauma is that it actually changes the way our brain operates. It changes the way memories are accessed and stored. It changes what happens chemically. And when you start to understand that trauma is much more than an emotional response, it actually causes physical damage to the survivor's neurology and to their chemical functions, their hormone functions. Do you start to understand why expert help is going to be needed? And that can help guide pastors in forming good community relationships with the type of professionals that are going to be skilled at healing those types of wounds, so that you can be coming alongside the survivor from all dynamics, the spiritual dynamic, the practical support dynamic, and also the medical dynamic, because there's real physical damage that happens in trauma.
Join us next time to hear how Rachel's faith influenced her heroic case against Larry Nassar. In the meantime, visit ministrynetwork.com, where you can talk about this podcast with other believers and get exclusive book discounts. You can also visit ministrynetwork.com/degree to see the new online offerings available at Westminster Theological Seminary.